Okay, so the lecture for Module 2 here, I'm going to focus on something that we call the labor-leisure decision. But before I get there, just a real quick background or some motivation about why this fits in this chapter. Right, so in intermediate economics, what we're really doing is getting deeper into the theory that underlies some of the stuff you did in your introductory courses. Right, so oftentimes I say, look, we know about supply and demand, and really what we're trying to do now is get into the heads of the people that are making these decisions. What's really going on with consumers when they decide how much of a good to purchase? Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to build the model of what's in their head. Okay, so the model of what's in their head, we call this consumer theory. They're going to maximize. Okay, we're going to ask them to do the best they can, and specifically they're going to maximize their utility, which is our measure of their well-being. However, they can't consume unlimited amounts of goods. They can't consume as much as they might like because it's subject to a constraint, in this case, a budget constraint. Okay, so much of what you're reading about in the chapter is building this theory of consumer maximization. And again, what we're trying to do is get into the head of the consumer. Now, remember that households, that consumers play two roles. Okay, so just basic circular flow. Remember that although we oftentimes focus on the product market, right? So the product market, the firm is giving goods and services to the households, and in exchange the households are passing money, right? So this is usually where we see the household on the demand side and the firm on the supply side. There's a whole other half to the economy. Okay, so we have the bottom half of the circular flow here where we watch inputs, and in this case, in the factor market or the input market, we have the opposite relationship. Okay, so here the households are the ones doing the supplying. So think of workers going to work for the firm. They're supplying their time, and the firm is the one who demands the resource, right? Who's looking to purchase in this case. So the labor-leisure decision that I'm going to use today is in this bottom part. Okay, the labor-leisure decision is here. The household is providing labor as an input into production, and we're going to talk about the labor market, and in particular, the labor supply curve. So there's a number of really good videos that I linked to that are on Khan Academy. In the textbook, author has done some as well that focus more on this part of it, right, that focus more on the consumer's decision making. And what I want to do is show you a very similar analysis, although one that focuses on the worker or the labor decision. Okay, so let's get started here. So the labor-leisure trade-off. Okay, so we're talking about the labor-leisure trade-off is an interesting model. It's a trade-off that can help us really understand not only worker behavior, but also how behaviors may change in response to policy changes. So we're going to start with this basic question of if you got a raise, okay, if you got more money, would you choose to work more hours or fewer hours? Okay, so before we get too deep into the models, just think about that for a second. If you got a raise, on one hand, you might decide to work more hours because now you're earning more money per hour. Okay, so every hour you're not at work is pretty costly. So for instance, we see, lawyers and doctors working very long hours, in part because if they don't work, they're foregoing a large opportunity cost, and then they pay for services like house cleaning or childcare, pickup, stuff like that, that they can outsource because they're earning so much money with it while they're at work. On the other hand, you might argue that really if you got a raise, maybe you would decrease your hours. And here the logic may be something more akin to if you're making more money, why not buy yourself some time off? Right? Once you have enough money, what's the need to work more time? Right? Wouldn't you rather be home with your kids or cooking your own meals and enjoying that leisure time? Maybe that's why you work. So it's a question here about what does our model predict? Does our model predict that when workers get a raise, will they work more hours or fewer hours? Okay, so we're going to use the logic of constrained optimization here. And with the constrained optimization, we could use calculus, And if you've taken a calculus class, it's a really interesting and nice application of calculus, but we don't need to. We can do the constrained optimization with a graphical analysis just as easily. Okay, so we're going to try and maximize utility, and we're going to have the worker get utility from both income and from leisure. Okay, they like to have money and they also like to have time. So they're going to maximize utility till, it's supposed to be an L in there somewhere, subject to a time constraint. So just as the consumer can't buy unlimited amounts of goods, the worker can't have unlimited amount of income and unlimited leisure, although that sounds lovely and be nice to be rich and to vacation all the time. The decision we're going to see is going to be a trade-off between the two. Okay, so let's get started building this here. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the assumption that you've got 24 hours in the day. And you can either work no hours and have all leisure, or you can work and earn income. Okay, so let's draw a couple points on this trade-off. Okay, so let's say, for instance, that you're interested in no income and only leisure. That would give you 24 hours of leisure. Okay, so this is going to be measured in hours. On the other hand, if you had no leisure and you decided to work the entire amount of time, you would work 24 hours of work, and let's assume, let's put a little assumption here, let's assume that you make $10 an hour. Okay, so if you work 24 hours at $10 an hour, your income will be $240. Okay. Now those are not the only 2 points that are available to you. Maybe you decide to do half and half. Maybe you decide to have 12 hours of leisure and 12 hours of work, which would net you $120. Okay, so here's another possible point. And so what we're going to see is that we're going to construct a line here that's going to represent all the different points that you could choose. And now which one you decide to choose depends entirely on your preferences. It may be completely rational for somebody to choose all leisure. And it might be completely rational for someone to choose all income, or 50-50, or anywhere upon this line. Okay? So the decision of what's right is not a decision that's a positive decision. There's no, this is absolutely always the correct decision. It's a normative decision about what people feel they should do, and it has to bring into consideration their own preferences. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this model of utility curves to model people's preferences. Okay? So for instance, if my preferences look like this, then I'm going to choose this point here. On the other hand, if someone's preferences look more like this, they're going to choose this point here. Okay, so there's no right point. It depends on the preferences. Okay, so now let's just keep working with this for a second. And now let's rebuild where we had this choice between 24 hours of leisure. Let me just note as I'm drawing here that leisure is not just play, it's not just sports and hanging out and watching TV. Leisure here is any non-paid activities. So leisure, in fact, is more properly leisure and home production. So anything you're doing that's unpaid is lumped in here with leisure. The point is it's not income generating. Okay? And then over here we had the option of earning $240. Now, let's say you get a raise. Like, woohoo, get a raise. So now you earn $20 an hour. It's a really big raise, doubled your income. Okay, so you have the same choice. If you wanted to work no hours, okay, get zero income, you can still have 24 hours of leisure. Okay, this point is still available to you. Whoops. On the other hand, if you decide to have zero leisure and to work the entire time, you now can work 24 hours. Be a lot of work. I guess we should assume sleep, but I'm trying to follow in your book, and they didn't assume sleep in your book, so I won't. Okay? Anyway, now you make $20 an hour, so now you can max out, if you so choose, at $480 in income. Okay? So the entire budget constraint, although here it's a time constraint, has rotated out. Okay? Again, these are not your only 2 choices. You could decide to take 12 hours of leisure. Okay, and now you're going to work half the time, and that should put you at 12 hours of work with your new fancy salary there we go, you would make $240, okay, with your 12 hours of work. So again, where you decide to be here, that's the question I pose, is you get a raise, do you decide to work more or do you decide to work less? What you decide depends on your preferences, okay? So you could have one person who decides that the optimal bundle, the optimal trade-off between work and leisure, goodness, that's being annoying, is here. Whereas you can have another person who has rational preferences, nothing wrong with these utility or indifference curves, they just make a different choice. Okay, so let's look at two different people. Okay, so let's compare two people with this situation. Okay, so we have person A and person B, and they're both going to face the same situation that we just set up. Okay. So they're both going to start with $10 an hour. So they can have 24 hours of leisure or $240. 24 hours of leisure or $240. Okay. And let's say, for sake of argument, that they both decide, we'll keep it simple, to work half the time and use the remaining time on leisure. Okay, so they both pick this point here in the initial situation. Okay. So they both, have indifference curves. Put them here. Okay. Now, they both get a raise. Okay. So they both get this raise from $10 an hour to $20 an hour. Okay. So they can both now earn up to $480. Whoops, having a little trouble there. There we go. Person B got the raise as well, so their new constraint allows them to earn up to $480 an hour. And the question is, what do they decide to do? Okay, so let's draw it such that person A decides their new optimal bundle. Oh no, my drawing's going to make it not quite the point I wanted. Well, this, okay, kind of messy. Let's clean it up just a bit. I think I can. Let's see here. Oh, I think I'll just start over. Okay, so now let's look at two people who are faced with the same choice. Right? They both start with the $10 an hour situation where they can earn up to $240. Let's call this person A. Let's call this person B. Okay, and as I'm drawing here, kind of making sure to label everything properly, let me just note that leisure, although I'm describing this as leisure, leisure is really any unpaid work. So this could be home production. So in fact, most times it's not leisure in the sense of watching television or playing sports or hanging out, right? We think of leisure like that. Here we mean leisure can be sleep, it can be, watching your kids, it can be cooking, it can be cleaning, it's anything that you're not generating income from. Okay, anyway, so here are the two people initially. And let's imagine that initially, just to keep it simple, they both decide that their optimal bundle is to spend half of their time working and half of their time on leisure. Okay, all sorts of different leisure activities. Some of them fun, some of them not so fun. Okay, now they both get a raise. Okay? So same as before, we're just drawing this out again here. Now that they make $20 an hour, should be a 4, they can earn up to $480 should they decide to work every minute available to them. $480. Oh. Okay. So here I've just replicated what we did before, but I did that because I want to show that these two people can make different decisions about how to use their time now that they've been given this raise. Okay, so here's person A's indifference curves. Okay, it's not drawn that well, but you see initially they chose to maximize here. And now they've gotten a raise. They get to a higher indifference curve. Oops. So that's certainly good. Right? So this is, let's call this U1. This is U2. They're happier on U2 than they were on U1. And notice that they've chosen to cut back on leisure a little bit. Okay? So person A has decided to take less leisure. And another way to say less leisure is that they're going to do more work. Okay? So person A decides that when they get a raise, that they're actually going to work more. Person B, on the other hand, okay, so let's draw their initial point was here. Okay? And now person B, let's say, oops, I'm having a hard time drawing today. There we go. Person B may decide to actually work more hours. Sorry, I said that wrong. Get more leisure. And if you get more leisure, that means you have less work. Okay. All right, so we've got a lot of lines going on. Let me back up and talk about what you're looking at here. So we had two people, person A, person B. Both of them started earning $10 an hour and then got a raise to $20 an hour. Both are rational human beings with utility curves that match all of the assumptions that were laid out in your textbook. Okay, so everything here is regular, but we see that they made different choices. Person A decided that in response to the wage, the increase in the wage, they were going to work more. Person B, on the other hand, responded in a very different fashion. They saw an increase in their wage, they got a raise, and they actually decided to work less. Okay? So we can use this analysis to look at how different people make different decisions depending on their preferences over income and leisure. Okay, so a couple of other final thoughts from here before we move into the policy application is what's going on? Well, the cost or the price, let's say the price of leisure was changing. So how does this relate to the analysis in your textbook? Well, here we see that effectively we're changing the price, okay, because the wage is the price of leisure because the wage is the opportunity cost. If you spend time sleeping, that's time you can't be working. If you spend time on the beach, that's time you can't be working. So when the wage changes, the opportunity cost changes, or in other words, the price of leisure changes. So just like in your book, when the budget line shifted or rotated because of a price change, that's exactly what we have going on here as well. Okay? We see that rotation because leisure effectively became more expensive and you could get more income if you worked. And again, that induced different responses from different people. Last thing I want to do is show how we can take this information and use it to derive a supply curve. Okay, in this case, a labor supply curve. Okay, so we're in the labor market, okay, and we're looking at the hours of labor. It's hours. And the wage. So let's look at person A and the choice they made. And let's look at the labor decisions for person B. Okay. So they both went from $10 an hour to $20 an hour. So we have 2 points from each of them. And we saw that person A, let me just flip back through here and get the numbers. Person A went from 12 hours of leisure down to 10. Okay. So if they went from 12 hours of leisure, that meant they were working. This is hours of work, mind you. They were working half their time. Okay. And now they're only taking 10 hours of leisure. Oh, goodness. Leaving them how many hours to work? There's 24 hours a day. They spend 10 of them lounging around, meaning they spend 14 hours at work. Okay. So person A, we now have 2 points. Oh, it's really giving me a hard time here. We now have 2 points on their labor supply curve. And person B, we can do the same thing. Person B, when they earned $10 an hour, they chose to take 12 hours of leisure and 12 hours of work. And busting back through here again, we see that with the change, they went from 12 hours of leisure up to 14 hours of leisure. Okay, so we ask ourselves, if they're taking 14 hours of leisure, how much time is left over for work? That means they were working 10 hours. Okay, so this, again, is hours of work. Okay. So this person has a supply curve that looks the opposite. All right, so now, what's going on? What do I want you to take away from this? Which of these looks sort of more normal? This one is the supply curve that we're used to seeing, okay? An upward sloping supply curve. But what we now know is that the upward sloping nature here really depends on the assumption that people decide to work more when the wage goes up. Okay? So do you induce more work with a higher wage? Now, oftentimes this is really appropriate. Like I motivate this in class when I teach. We talk about the market for babysitting. And if I say, I'll pay you $10 an hour to watch my kids, I get maybe 12 volunteers. But if I say I'll pay you $20 an hour to watch my kids, lo and behold, I get a lot more hours of work available to me. I have people sort of falling over themselves because they want to watch my kids for $20 an hour. Okay? So those assumptions we can motivate pretty easily. We're talking about opportunity costs and the likes. But a more nuanced discussion here makes us realize that it is entirely possible that we get a downward sloping supply curve, which looks funny, right? We're not used to seeing supply slope downward, but what's going on is this was person B who made very rational choices. Let's go back and revisit what was going on in person B's head. As the price of leisure changed, okay, person B decided, hey, I think now that I'm making more money, I'm actually going to buy myself some time off. Okay, I can work fewer hours and get the same income. Sorry, didn't mean to hit that. Here they are working fewer hours and getting the same income, and that looks good to them. Okay, it's a very rational choice. It's an interesting choice. And what we'll find here then is the higher the wage, right, the lower the hours of work. And my last point will be that this has really interesting policy implications. Okay, it's not just an academic conversation because it matters, for instance, for tax policy. So when you tax, you effectively change the wage. If you add a tax, right, so you can think of a tax on wages as effectively lowering the wage. It's lowering the take-home wage, right? On the other hand, you can think of things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which are subsidies. So a subsidy on wages, you're effectively increasing the wage. And what we want to know is what kind of an impact should we expect on the hours of work? Do we think that if we increase taxes, effectively lowering people's wages, do we think that they'll work more or work less? On the other hand, if we extend an earned income tax credit to workers, right, effectively subsidizing their wages, do we expect them to work more or to work less? And the answer is it depends. It depends on whether we think the labor supply curve is upward sloping or downward sloping. And because theory doesn't give us a clear prediction, this becomes an empirical question, meaning we have to go get data on it. And so labor economists have done this, right? They thought, okay, let's look at different wage rates and see what happens to hours. And in fact, what happens is we see a little bit of both. Okay? Empirically, the labor supply curve tends to be what we call backward bending. So we see that at low wages, it behaves sort of like a more normal supply curve, but at higher wages, people start to buy themselves some leisure, okay? They start to buy themselves some time off. And in the language of what you're reading about in this chapter, in this region, the income effect dominates, right? They're richer, so they're buying themselves some more time. And down here, the substitution effect dominates, which is basically saying they're substituting away from leisure towards work because it's now more profitable to work. And in fact, I'm being a little dramatic here because empirically, it's not even that bendy. It's more like this, okay? And empirically, for very large regions, okay, for a lot of the time, there's sort of no effect. And what we would say here is that we find that the labor supply curve, in fact, is quite inelastic, that people work about the number of hours they're going to work no matter what. So this really goes back to, remember at the beginning of the story, I said, assume you're a wage worker. Well, if you're a salaried worker, right, you're going to work about the amount of time that you're going to work. Okay? We see that around 40 hours a week, there's a lot of inelasticity or a lot of wage non-responsiveness. But there is some interesting effects sort of at the very top and the very bottom. So again, at low wages, we see that raising the wage will actually induce more hours. And at high wages, we see that raising the wage will actually induce lower hours of work.